Okay. So I am going to call this meeting of the Salem Keizer Budget Committee to order. And in terms of attendance, I know that Jesse Lippold is not here, and Mark Bateman is not here, and Marty Hyen is calling in, but I believe Adam Kohler is also not here currently. So, but I think we have everyone else. Okay. So the first item on the agenda is the election of a chair and vice chair for this year. The protocol is that the chair and vice chair alternate between community members and board members. So we need to elect a board member as chair this year and a community member as vice chair. So what we'll do is take nominations for chair, elect a chair, he or she will take over, and then we will elect a vice chair. So do I have nominations for chair? Chuck?
Madam Chairman, I would like to nominate for Budget Chair Sharon Palazzi.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Other nominations?
Would you like to be chair? Sure.
Seeing none, can we have an election by acclamation?
Landslide.
All those in favor?
It's a mandate from the people.
Aye. All those opposed? Okay. Have a gavel.
Yeah, take your.
This way you get to be my neighbor.
Back together. Okay, so first of all, I would just like to say thank you for your service last year. Thank you very much. Rachel did a nice job. Okay, so moving on to the election of the vice chair of the Budget Committee. I'm sorry, Paul?
I'm waiting and make a
Okay.
nomination.
Okay, I would take nominations. Paul?
I would like to nominate Levy Herrera Lopez.
Second?
Okay. Are there other nominations? Okay, wonderful. Seeing none, we'll take a vote. All those in favor of Levy as the vice chair of the Salem Budget Committee, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Great. Congratulations, Levy. Does he have a say? I think he voted. He did not oppose.
So do you want me to just?
Yes, please.
Yep, I'll just jump in. All right, so our first report is the Transportation Infrastructure Report, and Mike Wolf, our Chief Operating Officer, will provide that report.
Is this on? Yeah, good evening. You've had a chance to take a look at the Fleet Infrastructure Report, and I'd like to highlight a few areas, and we'll start on the first page here. Just give you a brief description that essentially we have a huge fleet. We have the largest bus fleet in the region, and you'll see on the backside once we get there just the number of buses and the age. We have different sort of age brackets here, but we have 269 school buses, and just to give you a sense of how many kids we serve, that's pushing about 24,000 students daily. And we also have close to 170 support vehicles, which so our bus fleet are our yellow buses, our yellow vehicles, and our support fleet are our white vehicles. And that's when you see those vehicles driving around the district, the white with the logo, that's what we're talking about. One of the issues that we've had over the years, and I think a lot of districts fit into this category as well, is it's almost feast or famine with respect to making large infrastructure investments in areas like fleet. In other words, when you have the resources and you can make the investments, you typically do. And so what that creates is, let's say, a bubble of 50 or 60 or 70 buses that got purchased 20 years ago. well, fast forward 20 years, there's 50, 60, or 70 of those buses ready to be replaced. And what you'll see is based on industry standards, and there is no set agreement among all of the 50 states, but in general, you think about all the city miles, right? I mean, if you have a vehicle and you do a lot of highway traveling, you can have a lot of miles on your vehicle, but it may last a long time. But with all the stop and go, and that's what buses do, they stop and go all over the city, right, door to door. It really, really takes a toll on these buses. So, for instance, our large buses, there's a norm of about a threshold of about 12 years of age for a large bus, and that pushes around 200,000 miles. I'm sorry, 15 years for large buses and 12 for small buses. And so that begins to add up, and you'll see on the back page when we get to the tables that we've created this sort of accordion effect over the years where we've been able to purchase in large quantities or fairly large quantities, and then there'll be years in between where we don't. Typically during budget cuts, that's not where districts spend their money. They spend their money on keeping teachers in classrooms and not in fleet. And so the downside of not being on a routine replacement schedule is maintenance costs increase dramatically as the fleet ages. And that's what we're beginning to experience with fleet in general. So if you go over to the backside, and it's not highlighted, but in the gray areas, in the matrices, you'll see that there are 112 buses. Now, this is both large and small. We didn't break it out into different categories for you, but you can see that there's 112 of our buses that are within the replacement window, and that's the lower highlighted area there, and with the commensurate costs associated with replacing them. And again, you can see that while we don't like those bubbles rolling through the system and that accordion effect, and we have 75 buses that we were able to purchase over the last 2 years because we had the funds to do that. So yet again, we're creating that dynamic in the system. And so and just to give you a sense, the small buses cost between 80 and 100,000 each, and the large buses between 120 and 130,000. So you get a sense of how much that can add up to fairly quickly. On the support vehicles, I'd like to make a correction. It says there are 35 vehicles. There are 29, so the number's actually a little better. We updated our reports, and I wanted to make sure you had the correct information. But again, you can see that basically we've got 29 vehicles that exceed our targeted replacement schedule, with an additional 15 heading in that direction in the next 2 years. And so, and then at the end of the chart, you can see what the replacement costs would be. One of the things that we wanted to highlight was included in these vehicles are the activity vans, which get a lot of use. And so those vans, we typically, instead of the 20-year threshold, because they're run so often, it's 15 years is the threshold, and we have 6 of those vans that are they need to be replaced, and that's at a cost of about $420,000. And I'm sure you've seen these. We call them the milk cartons, the milk vans. But our schools rely heavily on those activity vans to move students around the district. So again, a couple of the challenges that we face again is that not having a normalized replacement cycle, and sure wish we could. But again, as you can see, we've got 75 newer buses in the system, and thankfully we do, because we had 9 buses this current year that just essentially stopped. They just stopped. And you don't put engines in buses that have already had 2 engines replaced. And so we've had to look into the operational budget, and thankfully you can do that when fuel prices aren't as high as you thought they might be, and there's a little bit of flexibility there. But replacing buses that just stop is not part of what we would consider an adequate replacement cycle. So I just wanted to highlight for you that we're kind of heading in that direction with the 112 buses currently targeted for replacement, and the 48 buses that will require replacement over the next 2 years. And then the other thing I would say is the pupil transportation industry is a very heavily regulated industry, and we have new mandated emission standards that require all of our buses to meet or exceed the 2007 standards by 2015. So we've actually been very innovative in the past, and there were some ODE grants for overhauling engines, and we've taken full advantage of those, but we still have a large portion of our fleet that will not meet those standards unless we invest in retrofitting or in replacing the buses. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions about the fleet.
Paul?
Okay. Does this take into account anything to do with the new travel we'll be experiencing over the next 3 years?
We'll probably make sure that we don't put older buses on that trip.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Okay.
Seriously.
No,
I mean, that'd be one of the
makes
last
sense.
routes you'd want to put an older bus on.
Right, exactly, okay.
Okay. Jim?
Can you talk a little bit about if we buy buses, how the transportation grant works back from the state?
Yes, yeah.
So we get some
Yep.
reimbursement.
So that's the other thing around our yellow bus fleet in particular, is we receive 70% depreciation on those capital purchases over a 10-year period. So that means our depreciation, the depreciation schedule is 7% a year, and that's part of the transportation grant that we receive that depreciation. And so but that's 10 years. So all of the buses that are 11 years and older are off the depreciation schedule. So we're not receiving any transportation grant funds for those. So that's another reason why you'd want to have a regular replacement cycle. So you've always got buses on the depreciation schedule.
I had a question, if that's okay.
Marcia, go ahead.
I'm just curious, have we changed, or what kind of change have we seen over 5, 10 years in the ratio of smaller buses to larger buses? Any?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. We're actually, we've changed our fleet so that the vast majority of the buses that we have are small buses. And when we say small buses, we mean buses that serve students with special needs primarily. And that's been our growth in routes, because while we have an incredibly effective transportation system, pupil transportation system in Oregon, because it's mandated, it's not a very efficient one when you have small buses that go door to door and maybe have 1 or 2 students on them because of the restrictions associated with the special needs. So it's an incredibly effective system, but it's not the most efficient to run that way. We do the best we can with routing, but just so you know, that's how it's set up.
Virginia?
So we have more buses than even the Portland.
Well, Portland outsources theirs,
Oh,
except
okay.
for small buses. They run their own fleet of small buses. But I'll have to get back to you on that. I know we're bigger than Chariots.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And Eugene, and, I mean, along the I-5 corridor. I wouldn't say we have more than Portland 100%, but I'll give you a 95% yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Just to dovetail off of Paul's question, what anticipated increase in costs in fuel and maintenance are we expecting with the increased travel?
We're still working that out with the innovative scheduling and the hard work that our ADs are doing. But we know that it's less than the original estimate, which I believe was around 650 or 700,000. But we don't have the exact number yet.
But we think we can get it down a couple hundred less. So, but we'll have that ready for the budget message.
Mike, I'm just curious, when we replace a bus and get rid of an old bus, assuming it still runs and can drive someplace, what happens with the old buses? Do we trade them in? Do we sell them?
Yeah, actually, it was fascinating when we got these 72 new buses in the last couple of years. We kind of ran almost like an eBay auction. And we have Salem Keizer buses that are now traveling all over the world right now. It's amazing how people love them. Yeah, so we sell them, and we get as much value out of them as we can.
When you purchase a new bus, is there a trade-in option on any of those, or is that?
It's not worth it. It'd be better for us to sell it or part it out. I mean, we keep a small fleet, if you will, of spares for parts, because we run our own part shop too. And so those older buses sometimes require older parts, and we have a few handy. Yeah.
In the auto industry over the last 20, 25 years, cars have gotten less maintenance, right? They last longer in many cases, some cases maybe not. So I was just wondering have buses gotten any better over the last 15 to 20 years? Does anyone know?
I'd have to say yes, just because everything gets better. But the industry or the standards that we're using, because here's what we do. We constantly reroute buses so that the heavier use buses are routed to easier routes. And so we're managing the entire portfolio of routes with our inventory to make sure we can stretch each bus as far as possible. So are they better than they were 15 years ago? I sure hope so. But it's still, it's hard work for these vehicles.
And I was thinking the maintenance mainly too. Shouldn't maintenance costs, you would hope, would go down a bit?
Again, you know, it's really interesting. With a new bus, there's, if you watch the graphs or see the graphs, and if anyone's interested, we can get you plenty of them. But the new buses, because of, they need a shakedown period, they actually have more maintenance initially, right, to get them up and running and sort of in the groove. And then about year 3 is when you hit peak performance. From year 3 to about 7 or 8, they're running at their peak performance, and then after that, you're in the atrophy schedule.
Thank you.
Are most of our full-size buses our larger ones, or are their routes full?
As full as we can route them, yes. Yes, I would say most of them are full. Now, it depends on when you see them during the route. If you see them at the beginning of the route, they don't look very full.
Right.
In the morning. If you see them at the end of their route in the day, they don't look very full. But generally speaking, we do. Now, we do have capacity on a lot of routes, but we're a home-to-school and school-to-home transportation. We're not a transit system.
Right.
So, you said that some of the small bus routes only had 1 or 2 students.
Mm-hmm.
How come we use small buses for those and not something smaller? I mean, small buses are still not small.
Well, we need that fleet, and when it's 1 or 2 students, usually those are students with medical needs, and so you need more than a van.
Yeah.
And so the small bus fleet gives us the flexibility for lots of students.
Okay.
Good question.
In any of those situations, can we offer parents some kind of incentive to bring the student? Do we do that?
Yes, we do.
Good,
Yeah, we have situations where we'll pay mileage.
good.
Yeah.
I just want to make one other comment. Sometimes you'll also see our buses away from our district because we have legal requirements that if a student is homeless and foster care, there's some different requirements for busing and to keep students at their home school if they're displaced. So I see a bus coming in to other communities mornings.
And the other thing I would say is there are about 28 overlays of different programs that our system supports. So it isn't just getting the kids from home to school. It's also supporting the music programs, right? Supporting accelerated math. I mean, the list goes on. WESD routes as well, because those are our students as well. So it can be a complicated system to route it all as efficiently as possible.
Thank you.
All right, next item is Cte and Measure 98, and Assistant Superintendent Carlisle will cover this item.
Thank you. I'm going to need to ask forgiveness from Director Green and Chair Kylo. There's a screen behind you that you might want to pay attention to in terms of some slides that I'll be sharing with you as we talk about career and technical education and specifically supplemental resources. Of course, we dedicate general funds as well to the staffing and the equipment and materials for our CTE programs. But I think what might be most interesting and informative would be to talk about the Carl Perkins grant. That's a federal grant that typically ranges from $400,000 to $470,000 annually, and fairly stable. It's been with us for decades, and we typically can count on a figure somewhere between the 400 to 470 figure. More recently, just in the past biennium, we started to receive some secondary pathway funds from Oregon Department of Education, and those funds are not something that we're planning on counting on every year, but back in 2016, we were able to receive $400,000 in funds for that. The calculation was based off of successful participation as a CTE concentrator for students who are economically disadvantaged. And then the most recent arriver to the scene is just new this year, the High School Success Fund, which we might remember was Measure 98 back on our November 2016 ballots. We have a group of 40 different programs in various states of development, and there are numerous directions that we're using and utilizing these resources. And so what I want to share with you tonight is just a brief overview of how these resources are being used to bolster our CTE programs across the district. But maybe first we'd want to see some data that supports our interest in bolstering these programs. I think it's important that we update ourselves on some important data around CTE. Our older notions of what vocational education might have represented in the past no longer apply. When we think about career and tech ed, we really need to think about it in terms of the successful graduation rates that we're seeing here. So if you are a one-time participant in a semester of a CTE class, you are 15% more likely to graduate from high school than your counterparts who didn't take a CTE class. And if you were to take that class in an approved program, state-approved program for a year, you're called a CTE concentrator, and you can see from the data there that we typically see a 20% increase in your likelihood of graduating within 4 years with your cohort. This is a big part of why we're happy to see more students enroll in our CTE courses. And in fact, from the 2014-15 school year to the 15-16 school year, we saw 700 additional students enroll in our courses overall. That was a 12% increase. And we suspect that those increases are going to continue as we expand and build our CTE vision across our high schools. Some of the ways that we spend our supplemental resources are to make sure that we're modernizing and innovating with our existing programs. I know that Cte gets a lot of attention, but we give a lot of attention as well with these funds at each of our 6 comprehensive high schools. And I'm proud to say that we've begun a new effort to bring Cte courses to our students at Roberts High School as well. We also have learned the value of clearly communicating career paths, and I'll share a little bit more about that with you towards the end of my presentation here. We really want to make sure that in everything that we're doing, we're giving students the opportunity to not only connect with their technical education teachers, but also people from industry. And so we're finding new and innovative ways to do that in some of the private-public partnerships that we have here in Salem Keizer, including the CTE Summit that maybe you got a chance to see back in February. We want to make sure that our instruction is current and relevant, and we want to make sure that we're paying attention, as I said, to all of the programs in each of our high schools. You can see more details in terms of how we did that in the packet that's provided to you tonight. But maybe what I'll do is focus just a bit on this Measure 98 High School Success Fund. Maybe you recall when you were voting that the focus for this measure was to increase graduation rates, to decrease chronic absenteeism, and to increase students' readiness for college and career. And so it's been interesting to pay attention to the guidance that we've been receiving from the Department of Education on this, but the resource is brand new this year, and so it's been an opportunity for us to have some deep conversations already in terms of how we might spend the money. This year, we received $5.86 million for Measure 98, and we are anticipating $6.1 million next year as the second year in the biennium. We do not know how long Measure 98 funds will continue to be provided to us, whether that's something that the legislature will continue to approve, and we also do not know at what level that funding would be. But we are focusing our efforts on those three main categories. So ways that we are doing that in Salem Keizer is to notice that we can expand the existing CTE programs in our comprehensive high schools. And as I said, at Roberts High School, and that's a new endeavor this year, and at Cte. So it has a reach over 13 different programs. The program expansion, especially at the comprehensive high schools, has been aimed at those programs that have high demand, high enrollment, and things like prep buyouts and perhaps additional staff have been infused into the programs there to help meet the needs of bursting classes. We've also seen a really good effort around dropout prevention. We are allowed under the law to spend 15% of Measure 98 funds on students in the 8th grade. And so we're doing that through some CTE program development work and then also some summer learning opportunities for the students. We are providing access to accelerated credit and college level courses. We're doing data analysis, a data system that allows us to do a deep dive on an early warning system. The figure that you're seeing there was a budget estimate that we initially thought we might need. We won't need that amount, and there's further conversation we could have about that. But at the time that we were developing the budget, we were anticipating the possibility of bringing in a team of high-tech engineers to develop a predictive analytics system, and we're finding that actually our needs are a little bit different than that. And then finally, as with all grants, it's important to make sure that we're factoring in the need for indirect support. Again, details in each of those categories are provided for you in your packets if you're interested. So Perkins and CTE secondary pathway funds are, they show up in your packets, and you can see the funding source for some of the various activities that we've focused on there. But again, our primary task there has been, our primary task there has been to keep solid funding for programs that might need modernization and innovation, and to make sure that we're paying attention to the needs of perhaps additional equipment, increased space or improved space for the programs, things of that nature. And you can see how we spent those dollars in the last couple of years.
I have a question.
Oops, sorry. Do you want to just hold questions till you're at the end, or do you want to take questions now? We're almost done. How about if we just wait until you're done? Yeah, Marty, we'll just wait until he's done. Thank you.
So as I mentioned before, I wanted to share with you a little bit about the work that we've been doing on clearly communicating career paths. Mostly I just wanted to show you this slide, this appearance of a poster that you're likely to see when you move around to our various secondary schools. This graphic is the result of some deep work that our recruiting and retaining development team has been working on with an outside consultant. His name is Mark Perna. He's a very compelling author and speaker, but he's also a deep thinker around helping us identify strategies that really work in terms of outreach to students. There's a little bit of a tagline that people use now, and it's reaching the right students for the right programs for the right reasons. And really what all that's about is helping students find a purposeful path into a CTE program that can then lead to a purposeful path beyond high school. And so these career trees, as you'll see, have a root system that describe a solid foundation, something that is absolutely critical to your success. And then the branches provide some examples of different career paths that you can have. So for each different CTE program, the career tree looks different and unique. This is a recent draft. It's not yet complete, but I thought it would be interesting to share with you so that you could see this work is reaching beyond just the high schools. It's also reaching our middle schoolers. A super important part of the strategy is to make sure that we're not just assuming that 8th graders rising into the 9th grade have all of the assets already figured out about how to navigate high school. So these sorts of strategies are really proving to be helpful, especially when we talk to our students and parents about developing your own competitive advantage. You can see that at the bottom of the poster here. And I'm sorry that the print is so small, but this poster, when I read each of the bullet points under these categories, these are applicable to any person at any age, any stage in their professional life. So it's great to be able to reach out to parents and students and say, would you like to finish high school with a competitive advantage in the workforce or in post-secondary education? And then to initiate some conversations about what that might look like. These are brand new tools that have been developed this year as a result of the deep collaboration our teachers have done with Mark Perna and a result of dollars that we've applied from the Perkins grant especially. So with that, I'd like to welcome any questions, and I think our first one might be from Marty.
Yeah. Marty, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't catch what prep buyout is.
Oh, great. Yes, thanks for the question. A prep buyout would be when a teacher in a high school might have 4 periods of instruction per day, and there's a guarantee that one of those periods is actually preparation for instruction. So they are working with students the other 3 periods, and then they have 1 period for planning. It might be possible for the school to initiate a conversation with that teacher to see if they'd be interested in additional income, and we call that a prep buyout. So their prep period then becomes an instructional period for additional pay.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I'm going to ask a question real quick. So regarding the plan that we submit each year, that's my understanding is it's submitted each year. It's reviewed by the Department of Ed, and then we submit outcomes the following year. Do they review? Is that correct? So
Correct.
and then they review those, and then we submit another plan. And I know we're not there yet, but is the idea that they're going to look at the success of how we're using these dollars, give us feedback, or do we have
for
an idea?
each different supplemental resource, it's a little bit different process. And with this Measure 98 process, we're just now engaging in the first ever district reflection tool that then turns into a plan that we will submit. They may kick it back to us and say, we like this and this and this, but we'd like you to revise a certain section of the plan. Interestingly, in the first year, there was very little guidance other than this is the intent of the use of the funds. And I think it was really just a result of legislature enacting the resource and there wasn't, maybe enough time for ODE to catch up to some of that guidance. But what they've provided for us challenges us in some ways to make sure that we are, as a system, paying close enough attention to early warning data that we might see with our freshmen, for instance. And there are a number of different indicators that we respond to as part of this process that we submit that plan.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, Kat, go ahead.
I just want to ask, is that the local Mark Perna that runs the international programs for financing? Or is it a Mark
I don't
Perna
think,
from
no,
somewhere
Mark
else?
Perna, I believe, is from Ohio.
Oh, good.
Yeah. He has come to Salem Keizer not only to work with our staff, but he was the keynote speaker at the CTE Summit last month.
Okay. There is a local Mark Perna.
Really?
That's quite well known, yeah.
Paul?
I have several questions. On your first page, Kelly, in the overview, it talks about provide current and relevant instruction. I see listed there Avid Institute. What are you going to do?
So Measure 98 isn't really the resource that we've typically used for that, but Perkins dollars have helped to ensure that one CTE instructor from each high school can go to the Avid Summer Institute and participate on the Avid team with the other teachers who attend.
And what's the cost of that to send one from each high school?
The cost
And
was.
they're paid their hourly, or they're just paid their travel? Or what is it that the Perkins covers?
Yeah, the cost covers the travel and Summer Institute registration,
But not their salary.
but not their salary, correct. And the cost was $2,100 per teacher when we were sending folks to Denver and other places around that required air travel. The costs will be less because we now have the opportunity to send people to the Summer Institute in Seattle.
Okay. And the Mid-Willamette Education Consortium, what is that?
I'm going to falter on the description of this, but it's in conjunction with Chemeketa Community College, and it involves workforce development and an opportunity for us to engage with a network of education collaborators.
Okay, under dropout prevention, the 1.4 million, you're looking at expanding credit recovery opportunities. What specifically are you doing? It looks like summer school is an option. Are there others?
There are. One of the deepest investments we've made is to increase the staffing in our connections programs. A few years back, we developed sophomore connections as a way to respond to severely credit deficient students entering into the sophomore year. So in their freshman year, they may have accumulated 0 credits. By invitation, these students were reached out to and encouraged to participate in the connections as a way of getting some positive traction. And so the Connections program has proven to be a successful strategy. The additional dollars have helped to fund staff positions for the junior and senior years as well. So we have Connections now for grades 10, 11, and 12.
Connections, does that mean that they must have a computer, they do it at home, or do they have to come in?
It is live instruction. Connections does not imply online instruction for these students. It's face-to-face, and it's at the new center on Commercial Street,
Do they have to come in?
Riverfront.
Okay. And then do we provide transportation for them to come in over the summer?
For some of our summer programs, students have the option to get other transportation, but we do provide transportation as well in the summertime, yes.
The engagement of the 8th graders, the 875,000, is that mostly salaries for the summer programs?
It would be mostly staff salary, additional earnings for existing staff to work over the summer, probably a 4-week. It might be a 5-week program. I'm not exactly sure.
That's a voluntary
Yes.
process?
Yeah.
No pressure?
I hope not.
Okay. Student access to accelerated credit college-level courses.
Yes.
I see Willamette Promise there. What's
Yes.
the extra cost with Willamette Promise? Since, as you and I have discussed before, any teacher in the district can teach a Willamette Promise class.
Well, if you're going to teach a Willamette Promise class, you're going to participate in a PLC with a college professor, and that professor might be at OIT, might be at Western Oregon University. So the funds pay for a stipend for the teacher, they pay for some travel time. If the PLC meets during a school day, then we cover with substitute costs. So those sorts of things comprise about half of that figure that we pay for the Willamette Promise. There's also a participation fee for school districts that want to be part of the Willamette Promise.
Okay, and then my last question, I promise, is on the back page, it talks about provide current and relevant instruction. It says Abbott Institute, 1 CE teacher, okay, per school, and that's paid by the Perkins. You said the cost was about $2,100 or less per person?
It was, I'm gonna say it's gonna be around 1,500-ish.
And that's for only the 6 schools, 6 high schools, or are we including Roberts and CTEC in that, so there'd be 7?
We do not have Avid at Roberts. We do have Avid at Early College High School. There is not a CTE. I'll have to get back with you on whether we send a CTE teacher from Early College High School, actually.
Okay, and that Abbott, the Institute, sorry, one more question.
Sure.
And that's for a week,
Avid Summer Institute is 3 days.
3 days?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kathleen?
Unfortunately, I have several as well. You said that enrollment in Cte courses had increased by 12%?
Yes.
And is that participants or concentrators, or is that a mixture of both?
Just single enrollments, so yes, participants.
Participants, okay. Are there any Cte courses that have been unsuccessful that we have eliminated?
Yes.
And how are those identified?
There are a couple of different ways that we identify programs that seem to have reached their end. One is student demand, and another is it a state-approved program? And that, I would say the third thing is, are we seeing the actual relevant and local need? And so we typically try to identify programs that are going to match with high-wage, high-demand opportunities for students after high school.
What are the current courses that are going to be offered at Roberts?
There's a business program at Roberts, and I believe that's the program right now. Is there another one?
Education is at teen parent, and state 3 is entrepreneurship.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then last question, you said the data analysis number is probably not accurate. Do you have an idea what you think that's going to get closer to?
Currently, the figure appears to be around 125,000, and some of that is possibly going to be covered by a different grant.
And that's primarily to identify students at risk in early fashion, so there can be intervention.
That's the highest priority. I think there's also the opportunity to just develop a more robust data system than the one we're currently using.
Okay, thank you.
I actually want to follow up on that. So we talk about engaging 8th graders. Is that where some of this data will be used? I know we've talked about this before in meetings, identifying those students at risk as 8th graders. So before they transition or as they're transitioning, how does that play in?
That's exactly the intent. It's not only to track how kids are appearing to do in school, but a deeper dive to look at all of the diagnostic information, what kinds of things students are engaged in while they're attending school, so that we can start to notice a number of different possible indicators of at-risk status. Happy to say that a nearby resource offered through the Willamette ESD seems to be really dialed into those things. There are 90 school districts right now that are participating in their early indicator and intervention system. And then in conjunction with that, there's the Oregon Data Suite that will allow us to track student attendance, behavior, and course success on an aggregate level that we certainly want to see at a district point of view.
Is that up and running?
Yes.
The data suite?
Mhm.
It is, okay. To follow up with that, so we identify students at risk and we know what if they're deficient in math or they're not quite, at the ninth grade math level or the ninth grade reading level. How do we, and I know this isn't necessarily related to the data, but how then do we hand them off to their high school successfully? Because that's where I keep hearing the challenges is that handoff. So we know who they are, we know what they need, but does the school that they're going to be attending have the capacity and the resources to provide what they need?
I'm happy to say and proud to say that the close connections that are being built by our middle school director and high school director, together with principals and our math leaders, those connections are really paying off, especially in terms of interventions that are being offered at the middle school level, and then information that can follow the students into high school. It might be that some students aren't really ready for Algebra 1 in the typical way that we've packaged it, and it's really helpful for high schools to know that up front. Unfortunately, you're not going to earn a math credit on any math course lower than Algebra 1, so it's mission critical that we get them up to that level as quickly as we can. But we do have a number of different possible interventions, and we have different ways of structuring Algebra 1 for students who are just at that level but need some additional supports.
And we are doing that? We're
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
Thank you, sorry. Go ahead.
A couple of questions. On the engagement of 8th graders, middle school is 6th, 7th, and 8th, right?
Correct.
In today's environment, I would think that, or I'm concerned that by the time you get to 8th grade, some patterns have been set, and you obviously all know that, and that reaching students is difficult. How are we reaching parents? That's really, especially the earlier, at the
Right.
earlier time, like 6th grade, when they enter middle school? Is there a,
Yes.
program
Thank you
for
for that
them?
question, because I think the way that this information came to you might be a little bit misleading, because this resource can only be spent on grades 8 through 12, the Measure 98 resource.
Oh.
And of course, there are a number of different strategies that all levels are using to engage parents and really develop that partnership together with parents in lots of different ways. I will say that the newest energy around those posters and what they represent are really resonating with educators in terms of a tool that they can use to have deeper conversations with parents. And some of the most interesting new developments happened at the CTE Summit, where students from the high schools were present in the evening to talk about their learning with 8th graders and their parents who came in. And over 200 8th graders came with their parents to learn about what they might be able to schedule for at the high schools. So for a first attempt, that just feels fantastic.
Oh, I wanted to tell you, I'm really impressed with that tree.
Yeah.
And the whole program, it sounds wonderful. And I guess my thoughts are with publicizing it to parents on a continual basis, because they're working, they're busy, they see it once and go, great, this is good. Here, look at this. But then they get on to something else. So, and having press about it too, I haven't seen anything, but who am I? The other question I have is about online classes and whether there's whether there's any growth in Cte in online classes, where students can take some kind of beginning engineering class online, not have to have a dedicated necessarily. Well, you still have to have someone in the room, I understand that, but you can have more students probably covered at a time. And what kind of growth we see for the online classes, because I really believe over time we're heading kind of in that direction for some areas.
Great questions again. I'm not aware of any significant efforts to bring online courses to Cte, but I know that some teachers are making a strong use of online learning opportunities to enhance what's happening in their face-to-face courses. So, and there are some teachers who are even using a flipped classroom model, not at Cte, I believe, but at, in some of our schools where the majority of the instruction happens in the web-based learning, and then the face-to-face is about making sense of it and problem solving. And some teachers are really enjoying that model. I will also say that just in this afternoon, I was talking with our principal at Roberts, who oversees the online SK Online program, and we have some of the highest participation in online courses that we ever have seen. And what makes me happiest is that we've just recently engaged a company that really provides rigorous coursework in ways that I feel good about. If we're going to have students participating in online classes, they're going to get a rigorous experience.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to ask a follow-up really quick to that. What is the completion rate for our online? Because having done some work around that area and seeing the challenges and the completion rates, do we know what our completion rates are?
Successful completion rates are not where we want them to be, and they range between 43 and 75% across our high schools. And I think one of the pieces that we've still got to wrap our brains around is initiative, if that makes sense. A student who's a self-starter is more likely to be successful in an online environment than a student who has a difficult time prioritizing that over other things. It just that's part of the challenge that we're facing there. But I do think that some ongoing efforts are beginning to show some promise at some particular schools, and what we need to do now is try to get the other schools to pay attention to what those strategies look like.
So, yeah, a couple questions. One very basic one for me. Do any of the CTE programs that we have in the district offer any kind of certification?
Yes.
Like, so-
It's interesting because each different program aligns to a profession that has a certification with a certain number of hours, and maybe we provide enough hours for students to actually earn that full certification, or at least they can accrue hours towards that certification. So it really is dependent on which kind of program.
So I'll follow up to that. So is that up to the student to figure out, or is that so would they know if I complete this program, I'm gonna have a certificate or?
It's a big piece of what the instructors share with the students and help them monitor to see where their progress is. And obviously, if they earn their certification, that's a big celebration. But even if it's not possible mathematically to have enough hours to earn a full certification, the instructors care deeply about letting the students know, and the next school or program know. These are the numbers of hours that students accrued towards their certification.
So another question is, how do all of the high schools and Cte, do they offer the same kind of a basic CTE program, or if not, how do you choose which programs are offered at each school?
Yeah, that's I'm proud of what we're doing, and it's a challenge. I'm proud that we have 40 different programs, and obviously there's no way that we can replicate 40 programs at any one site. So what we've done to answer that, in order to make sure that any student can access any program that they wanted to, we have a transfer policy that allows students to say, I really want to be part of the mechanical technical program to work on automobiles. And I know that they have that at Sprague, McKay, or McNary. And I'm going to apply to go to McNary. And then we have a way then of approving that based on their desire to be part of that program.
But for instance, how would you choose, or what's the criteria for saying a school will offer cabinetry versus a school that's not going to offer that? Or what school is going to offer auto shop versus the school is going to offer computer technology?
Great question. We look at the portfolio of programs that any particular school offers and then ask ourselves, where is the next great opportunity for that high school? Or are they really kind of full with programs and we need to perhaps look at a different high school to lay in a new program? So there are a lot of different moving parts to that. Some of it might be student enrollment in the existing programs. Some of it might be how students are expressing a need or a desire. It might be the principal saying, I really want to see this program happen in my school. So it's a number of different moving parts, and thankfully we have a really adept leadership group in our director of high schools, our Cte coordinator, Jim Orth, and some other folks who are at the table making those decisions together.
Sometimes it's also facility constraints.
And my absolute last question, and I think this is the easiest one of the ones that I have, is if you're looking at, say, 5 or 10 years down the road, do you see our program offerings looking the same? Or if you had, your magic 8 ball and you could look into the future, how would you see this program shift?
Thank you. I hope we always evolve and adapt to the needs of our workforce and our community, and mostly our students. I think it's really important that we stay responsive to all of those things, and I don't think we can ever remain static. I believe the expansion that we're seeing will continue for a while. I don't think we're done seeing an expansion of the number of programs we offer or the number of students that we're serving. We have passed the halfway mark in terms of how many students are now participating in a Cte course. I think last year we were at 56% of our student population in high schools. But I suspect that we'll continue to see an increase, and it might not stop until we're closer to 65%.
One more question. One of the things that's always concerned me about, and you said, of course, we can't have the same offerings at every school. It's just physically impossible. But I worry about kids that can't avail themselves of the in-district transfers because of social circumstances, transportation issues, having to work after school and things. Do we have any way to get an idea about how many kids might be in that situation where they would love to avail themselves of a course that's not near their home school?
Not easily, because obviously you wouldn't apply for a transfer unless you'd kind of figured out, yeah, that's really where I want to go, and I have the means to get there. And as you heard, we're already challenged with transportation, so we can't offer transportation for every kiddo who wants to go across town to access a program until they're juniors. And then they can apply to participate at Cte, and we do provide transportation there. So our encouragement to students is, even if you've never picked up a hammer, you can be part of the residential construction program at Cte. It's not like what you did in 9th and 10th grade is going to rule you out of opportunities at Cte. And so that's currently what we can do for students who might not be able to access transportation otherwise.
Do you have any feel for the 44% that aren't going to Cte or haven't taken any of those classes? How many of those, what percentage of those are college bound, and what percentage are we trying to get into a vocational type field of some kind?
Right. Well, first of all, I think we see overlap between students who are participating in Cte courses and students who are college bound. And we're going to see even an increase in that because what profession doesn't require more post-secondary education? So there's just a nice back and forth around that. But we do see some students who prefer to take a full load of what we would typically describe as college prep courses and don't seem to express an interest in career tech ed. We also see a number of students who choose to devote a big chunk of their elective time to either foreign language or to music or other fine arts pursuits. And so it's not that every student has to take a CTE course, but we're certainly going to strongly encourage it. At the end of the day, every student needs to drive towards a career. For many of them, college has to be the path to get to the career that they wanted, but not for all. And so with that, we're trying to make an abundance of opportunities available to our students, and that's why I think we can continue to see increased participation. I do worry about the students who don't choose any of those things and are not really engaged in something that hooks them. And
Absolutely.
we all worry about those kiddos.
A great deal. So, no, I won't ask that. Go ahead.
I was going to see if, Marty, do you have a question on this subject?
No.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question. You were talking about how we're beginning to partner, and we do partner with local communities to better understand what our economic needs are and the trades. So when we hear things like, you know, we have a shortage of advanced manufacturing and the medical community, how do we adapt and adjust from year to year? So as we're planning for next year and we know what the needs are, how nimble are we in our ability to adapt?
Well, we're certainly not as nimble as that, where, you know, in a year's time we can curtail one program and begin another. But I do think that it's important that we continue to pay attention to what the local economy is saying are the projections for the coming decade. And are we preparing students to be relevant to that economy? So that was a big part of the process that helped us identify the programs that we wanted to bring into CTech. And it continues to be how we decided, for instance, what to bring into Roberts and how we might expand at the neighborhood high schools as well.
Thank you. Okay. We probably should move on. I'm sorry. Is there? Okay.
All right, so next item is follow-up questions on any of the other materials you've received or anything else from the materials tonight.
Is this the class size one as well?
That would include the class size because that was one of our follow-up.
Okay, I do have
All
some
right.
questions on that.
Okay,
So I don't know who I'm directing these to.
Linda.
Linda. Linda, in your report, it talks about class size does not affect access to advanced placement or IB courses, but it's based upon staffing. So staffing is the limiting factor? Yes? I don't know. I hear you.
So staffing is a limiting factor in CTE courses and is not a limiting factor in AP and IB. And so re-ask your questions since I'm clearly not answering what you're asking.
Well, the statement says students are not denied access to AP, IB courses. Additional sections are added as necessary based upon available staffing. And so staffing, if it's not available, then students are denied.
We have many more staff that are trained and available to teach AP and IB courses
Okay.
than we do, for example, a CTE course.
Okay.
So being able to add an additional section of AP government versus being able to add an additional section of cabinetry.
Okay. I see. I guess I see the point. As I drop down to 35 and 45 students, I see personal fitness and weight training. Also, I see it at 45. So is that a double count?
No, so that means those classes were listed there if they were in 3 or more of the comprehensive high schools. So that means 3 of the comprehensive high schools have personal fitness or weight training between 35 and 45, and 3 of the high schools have personal fitness and or weight training at more than 45.
Okay, which leads me to my next one. With fewer than 10 students, doesn't JROTC require some sort of standard to get into it? And are all JROTC classes 10?
So that specific course is, I just know from
Mhm.
memory, that is the Air Force JROTC course at McNary. I don't have the exact numbers on enrollment of the JROTC courses, I believe are at North.
Okay, and then as an ex-math teacher, I would love to have a class of 10 of Algebra 1. Are all Algebra 1 classes 10? That's what that implies.
Well, the following classes have, so the clarifying statement would be the following classes have one section or have a section of fewer than 10 students at 6 comprehensive high schools.
So for the general ed courses, there's one section.
Potentially. And it's 11 pages of data, and I have it broken out by school. So there is at least one section of a regular Algebra 1 course.
Somewhere that's got 10 in it.
Correct.
Okay, the way I read that, it implies that there's more. And then on the back page, what's a social worker referral?
So we have social workers that schools can make specific referrals for social work support. And, sorry, let me put my hands on that one. So I believe we have 5 full-time social workers employed in the district. And from September of this school year through February 22nd is when this data ended. There were 453 total referrals made for student support to those social workers.
So what type of support does a student or family get?
So a school may be referring based upon concerns of neglect, may be referring based upon concerns of potential mental illness. There would be a variety of reasons that would
Housing,
pinpoint.
food.
Okay, and cadre, what's cadre?
So behavior cadre are highly trained, classified staff members who come in basically to address crisis behavior situations in classrooms. And so those are 176 times we have sent in a highly skilled classified employee into a certain classroom to support behavior management of one specific student and provide training to future staff members who will continue to work and support that student over time.
Okay, and can I surmise from this chart that the ELL students are not the great source of the problem?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
This is actually on the research on class size, and one of the things I wasn't sure about was, they talk about the class size effect not being all that big, but one of the things I've always wondered about that research is often it's sort of, if you change the class size from 20 to 22, something like that. So what concerns me in looking at that is, it's always, each budget decision is, are we going to lower the class size by 1 or raise it by 1? And each year that you decide not to lower it or that it's okay to raise it, it seems like a small thing. But, it seems to me less likely that the difference between 20 and 40 is a negligible effect. And that, that it's easy always to say, well, that it's really a small effect, so we're not going to worry about it. But if you do it for enough years, you've made a fairly significant effect. And that particularly they talk about all the other things that are more important, like making learning, personal connections and things. That at what point does class size get in the way of your ability to do those things that he lists? So that, that's
It's important.
it's just sort of a worry about this trying to give everything its little decimal number without a lot of detail about what it really means and what things are connected to what.
Agreed.
Yeah. So, Rachel, so John Hattie's, so the meta-analysis about a 0.21 effect size. There were a handful of studies that were included in his meta-analysis that attempted to articulate, I think, what you're trying to get to, and a handful of those would say that really there's not a demonstrable impact on student achievement until you get down to somewhere in the 14 to 16 student range in a classroom. That you could potentially make a valid argument that if you were to get class size down to that level, you could begin to say that there is a demonstrated increase. I didn't review closely enough, but I didn't see standing out any studies on the other end saying at what point is too many just too many.
I mean, it's always worried me a little that almost all the research I've seen on class size is looking at sort of 2015, when an awful lot of school districts in the country, the question, I mean, that 15 is kind of out there and unrealistic, and what you're really saying is 40, at what point does this become a real impediment? And
I also think it doesn't factor in some of the other student factors that make 25 hard in some places, in some classrooms, physical space, student behaviors, trauma, whatever it is. There's lots of other factors that when you just straight look at the class size research, it doesn't address.
Yeah.
On the behavior learning chart with all the referrals, I'm curious as percentages. I see totals 453 for social workers, et cetera. Is that out of 24,000 students?
Yes.
So the percentage would be about 0.00. I mean, how are we doing is, I guess, the bottom line question.
So the bottom line question is we have 42,000 students. And this level of referrals, although small percentage, in some cases, big impact because these are our tier 3 and our students exhibiting in those tier 3 behaviors. So when, and social worker, our families in crisis. So small percentage, big impact. And I think that schools across the district would say that.
Thank you.
Well, I think the numbers that we've talked about really reinforce the long ago research that was done on class size. And it says it really isn't significant until it's really large difference. So 15 or even less shows a significant improvement. But really, a change of 1 or 2 or 3 does not.
Oh, sorry, Kathleen. On the social worker referrals, if we have 5 FTEs that are managing that caseload, that seems to be a pretty intense number for those very high-need kids and families. Is that, do we have enough resources dedicated towards that, or should we look at that further?
I would say no, but it wouldn't be, if I were adding resources, it wouldn't be the highest priority. Even though I'd still say not enough resources.
Okay. Any other questions on the additional materials that were provided to us? No? Okay, great.
Right, we're good to jump into PERS?
Yes.
And with that, Madam Chair, I have to get out to my son's baseball game to pick him up, and I know a little bit about PERS, so I think I'll flip out on this one.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Wolf.
All right. Well, shoot, Jim always helps me through this conversation, so not tonight.
You're on your own.
Totally
You're on your own.
appreciate it, yeah. So you may or may not have brought the briefing on this from last meeting, but if you did, you can refer to this and the one that we'll go over tonight. And last meeting, you asked for kind of the basic sort of PERS 101, so I'm going to go down that path, and then if you have any specific questions related to what we talked about tonight or at the last meeting, we can jump into them. So basically, PERS is a state agency, and it has 5 board members appointed by the governor. Just to give you a flavor for those members, 3 are people with experience in business management, pension management, or investing. 1 is a person in state management or an elective office, which would be perhaps a board chair at a school district that is part of a governing body that is in PERS but not a state agency, give you a sense. And then 1 representative is representing the public employee, either current or retirees. So there's the makeup of the 5. And that was a significant reform back in the 90s or early 2000s, I believe. Early 2000s was part of that. And before I go any further, for people who are really interested in this subject, you can get this document called PERS by the Numbers. And it may put you to sleep, but there's a lot of information in here. It's got tables of all of the reforms from the beginning. You may be interested to know that even though right now we're in a pretty bad spot as far as unfunded actuarial liability, in 2007 we were at 111.5% funding. So it is possible, right? So that's a document. And then most recently, the governor initiated a PERS Ual Task Force, and that report is out online as well to give you a sense of some of the ideas to reduce the UAL statewide. So PERS maintains 3 separate retirement programs, and you can see them there, Tier 1, Tier 2, and OPSRP, which is Oregon Public Service Retirement Plan. So essentially, those are the 3 tiers, and each of them reflected a different reform in a different legislative session. 95, 97 was a big reform biennium. 2001, 2003 was another big reform. And so essentially the basis for the unfunded actuarial liability, which is essentially the shortfall between what benefits are owed and the funding of the system, essentially. And you can see that all school districts are aggregated in a single pool for the purposes of actuarial modeling and rate calculations. State government is in a pool as well. And so, as I had mentioned before, our UAL as a district was 0 because we issued $50 million worth of pension obligation bonds in early 2015. And the latest report shows that our UAL now is over $480 million. So that gives you an idea of how quickly things can change in 3 short years. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the components of the PERS rate, so and our district rate in particular, which was on the other sheet that we provided last week, but I can go over some of those. You have the normal cost, the normal operating cost, which is the annual cost assigned to the current year. So if, for instance, you're a district and you haven't issued pension obligation bonds, your normal cost would include the cost, your annual cost, right, to be in the system and operate, but also your unfunded actuarial liability. So for us, we have issued over the course of the years from the early 2000s until most recently in 2015, right at $250 million, $250 million worth of pension obligation bonds as a district to lower our unfunded actuarial liability. And what that does is set up what's called a side account in the PERS system. And those side accounts actually work to lower our rate. In fact, our rates have experienced between basically 7 and 10% lower because of the side accounts, which has saved the district tens of millions of dollars over the long haul. And so it's a good investment when the market works in your favor. I can tell you that districts or any municipality that issued pension obligation bonds in 2007 or 2008 aren't doing so well now because that's when the market fell. So for it to work, you have to have at least a few good years early on to generate the savings over the 20-year period. And we've been very fortunate as a district, as have others as well. So you have the normal cost. You also have the 6% employee pickup, at which the employer picks up in this district. So the district, so to participate in the PERS system, by law, by statute, the employee has to contribute 6% of their salary, their payroll. Back in the 80s, I believe, in lieu of salary increases in state government, which is where I think the conversation began and then moved into other public jurisdictions, in lieu of a salary increase, it was negotiated that the employers would pick up to 6%. Not all employers pick up to 6%. In fact, just north of us in Portland, employees pay the 6%, which means salary schedules have been adjusted accordingly to compensate for that, which actually costs the district more because of the payroll costs associated with higher salaries. So it actually saves the district money in the long run to pick up the 6% employee pickup. And then, as I'd mentioned, there's the debt service obligation. So for our rate, we have the three components: the normal cost, the 6% employee pickup, and the debt service obligation. And that equates to, for the current year, 17-18, a range between a little over 26% of payroll costs and a little more than 31.4%. And the reason that there's a difference in range there is essentially because of the Tier 1, Tier 2 costs and the OPSERP costs are different payroll. And so that's a percent of payroll. So for every dollar that we pay in salary for a Tier 1 or Tier 2 employee, we add 31.4 cents to that cost, just to give you a sense of what that means. And then, like I had mentioned, the overall state PERS UAL is right around $20 billion as of December 31st, 2016. That's a big number. And the 2019-21 evaluation will be available in September of this year. And so the way the rates are set, PERS rates are set for each biennium based on the odd year valuation. So PERS will be, they're calculating the valuation of the system as of December 31st, 2017, last December, okay? They'll release those biennial rates in September of this year, and that will set our rates for the next biennium. So our rates really don't change for 2 years. So what that means is, even though the market seems to be doing really well now, it doesn't matter, because it's what happened last year that matters the most. So you see what I mean? So there's a lag in that. We wish that it wasn't that way, but it is. And in this current biennium, we had been anticipating about a 5% increase, or $10–11 million. And the way that we've handled that over the years, and you can see on these bullet points, we have these conversations every year at the Budget Committee about PERS, because it's one of our major cost drivers. And so in the 14-15 budget, the Budget Committee approved, as was presented to the Budget Committee, a $3 million transfer into the PERS reserve in anticipation of these costs, followed next year by the same amount transferred in, because we had a 3-year buildup of about $9 million into the PERS reserve, which was the last year of that $9 million 3-year buildup in 16-17. Last year was we increased our payroll rate so that we could put another $3 million into the PERS reserve. And so where the PERS reserve sits now, and you can see it in the current adopted budget, is right around a $16 million unallocated reserve. That means after we pay all of our debt service, there's about $16 million in the reserve. And that will become increasingly important, and because every even year, so in December of 16, the PERS sends out an advisory rate. It's not the rate that will be established for the next biennium, but it gives you a heads up of what might be coming. And our advisory rate shows an increase of about 7%. And what does that mean for us? That means that we're estimating about $34 to $35 million of increased cost in PERS alone in the next biennium, which would be the 1921 biennium. So having PERS reserve in place helps mitigate some of those costs in the next biennium. So we just kind of wanted to give you the 101 here and answer any questions that you might have regarding where we are with PERS. And also, I would say that in the last month, in the matrix that we gave you, we have the district PERS fund maintains a reserve target of approximately 50% to 75% of the 5-year annual debt payment average. So we look out 5 years and see the average of what those payments will be, and we like to keep that reserve amount between 50 and 75% of that average. And at around 16 million, we're close to 70%. So we're within our 50 to 75% target. All that to say is I wish it was more, given what we see coming towards us in the next biennium, but at least we have what we have. I'm open for any questions on that.
Question? You did such a great job explaining PERS.
Can I
It's
ask-
such a bummer of a topic.
So at the last meeting, you were talking about how in the future it starts to look better.
Yeah, that's way in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll
That's-
still be around.
That's in this report, by the way, if you want to see it. The latest estimate says that employer net contributions won't decrease until the 2035-37 biennium. So we're on a constant incline for a long time. And then, but a lot can happen, right? I mean, the market can just explode for the next 5 to 7 years. And like I said, we were 111% funded in 2007. In fact, 8 years leading up to the Great Recession, the fund was one of the best funded in the nation, hovering right around 100% funded for almost a decade. And then we're still recovering from the Great Recession, but we're also recovering from PERS board decisions like every time, well, the Morrow decision that rolled back in, I don't know how many remember the grand bargain that Governor Keizer put together, where there were actually some PERS reforms that bent the cost curve in a big way in the future that got overturned, which is a common theme in Oregon as far as reform movements for PERS. And so that added another 500 million, I'm sorry, it was 5 billion back into the UAL in one fell swoop with that decision. And then the board, PERS board, has lowered the assumed earnings rate because the market wasn't performing up to the 7.5% assumed earning. So every time the market doesn't perform to the assumptions built into the system, that adds to the unfunded actuarial liability. So they adjusted the assumed earnings rate. Now is down to, used to be 8% years ago, now it's down to 7.2%. Well, every time that decision gets made and the assumed earnings rate is lowered, by definition, that means we don't expect those market returns at the higher level, which means we're that much underfunded in the future. So it's a combination of things, but I will say the Morrow decision added a lot back into the unfunded actuarial liability for the state.
How often can they meet and make that adjustment? Is that quarterly that they can meet?
They meet monthly.
So they could make that, because I know they made that adjustment a few times last year. So
They
can
did.
they can continue to do that this year? And
They can, but it really is based on research and forecasts, and the 8% assumed earnings rate was unrealistic. The 7.5% wasn't, it was better than the 8, but it still wasn't realistic, and it wasn't what other large pension plans were using. That's the other factor. And so they could have went lower. In fact, one of the assumptions was right around 7, and the PERS board stayed at 7.2. So you're right. They can adjust, and every time they do, our unfunded actuarial liability will increase the second they make that decision.
Chuck?
I kind of feel like we've been very responsible as a district in regard to PERS, considering the magnitude of the problem. I'm just curious, are there other school districts in the state that have not handled this well, and what kind of consequences are out there for districts that just can't meet the obligation of PERS?
You know, I don't have any that I can reference offhand, but I will say those that entered the issued pension obligation bonds in 2007, 2008, that ended up costing those districts. So it would have been better in retrospect not to have issued the bonds, so they have higher operational costs because of that. And essentially, just like any other state entity, public entity, we have to balance our budgets. And so if you have more expenditures than resources or revenue, that means you're making cuts. And so if you're one of those districts that didn't enter the market at the right time, and you're a flat enrollment or declining enrollment district, it's, I
Which
mean, you
would
have
think
furlough
there's
days.
Quite a few districts in that spot.
Pardon?
I would think there's quite a few districts in that situation.
You know, it's in one of these reports, I could find that out, but I don't know that there were a ton that entered the market in 7 and 8. Most went in early 2000s, like between 2002. This became available to us in 2000 as districts to be able to, we had the authority at that point to enter into PERS obligation bonds. And most hit it hard in the early 2000s, as we did, and then kind of sort of waited, luckily.
Go ahead.
So I don't know if we can answer this yet, but I'm going to ask it anyway. A couple legislative items came out. One was the governor putting some money aside for unfunded actuarial liability. Do we project any impact of that? And then the second one is around the matching fund, because we do have PERS reserves, which is unusual for a district. I don't know if we've heard much about that yet.
It was part of the task force that the governor put together. I don't really know that it will have. First of all, I think anything that the state can do to lower this is a good thing. But we're talking about the order of magnitude here of $20 billion, and so for the matching fund, what the state is doing is helping districts, because before this you had to have at least $1 million to put into a side account. Well, that's pretty tough for some districts. And $1 million isn't really going to have that much of an effect on your UAL, to be honest with you. And, well, I guess it depends on the size of the district, but the barrier was the $1 million. And now that's been removed and reduced, and there's an incentive fund which will match up to 25% of what a district does put into their side accounts, but it's a pay-as-you-go. So it's cash, as opposed to debt service or issuing bonds. If we could get 25% of state money by issuing bonds, we'd probably be having a different conversation at the board. But it's not, the incentive fund, the matching fund isn't eligible for pension obligation bonds. I don't know if I answer your question, but that's all I got.
Just something to keep our eyes on.
Yes.
So my question also was about those side accounts, and that matching portion is the incentive that has been suggested?
Yes.
Through Governor Brown, she said there will be incentives, and then I think just recently it said they weren't decided, but that is the 25%?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, direct contribution, cash into your side account if you have one, yeah, as a district.
So do you see that as being successful right now? I mean, there's lots of districts that are in similar positions as we are without side accounts. Whereas, who's going to participate in that?
That's a really good question, and it's a board by board, school district by school district analysis, really. And again, it's really part of your annual budget development process to determine how much money any school district would put into that versus classrooms or buses or any other need. Yeah, I hope it helps. I think, first of all, it's an incentive, and only time will tell how many participate.
Did you see anything else in the list of suggestions that you think will make a significant difference?
I think anything that helps districts pay down their UAL is beneficial. And there are recommendations in here to make it easier to issue pension obligation bonds. And I think, because a lot of smaller districts, I think, may decide to head in that direction if it wasn't so cost prohibitive. And so, as a large district, we can absorb the cost of the analysis, to do that, the financial analysis, sensitivity analysis, all of that. But as a smaller district, that can be a huge barrier to even beginning the conversation. So I think they've removed some barriers to that so that it'll make it easier for boards to have that deliberation.
So that isn't always a good idea, though.
You really have to weigh the odds, and that is certainly up to staff to present the recommendation and for the board to deliberate.
Any other questions?
So, how often does the board issue those, or how often can they issue those pension obligation bonds? And does the performance of the stock market only impact this, our debt when those bonds are issued, or generally at any time?
So that's a good question. So the board can issue pension obligation bonds anytime that they feel the need to do that. Now, there's a fair amount of analysis and assessment that goes into that, presenting the recommendations to the board. And this Salem Keizer board has only done it 3 times since 2002. And so it's not something that the board takes lightly. And you are essentially, there is risk in the decision because another recession could hit, or returns may not be as healthy the first few years. And what's most critical in this transaction is that maybe the first 3 years you receive higher returns, and the rest of the 20-year period you could ride off of that. But if in your first 3 to 5 years you're receiving negative returns, it was a bad investment, which means it will cost more, and the debt service for these bonds comes out of the general operating fund. So the only way it makes sense long-term is if you're saving general fund money by doing this, not costing the general fund more by doing it. So there's your risk.
With the board having borrowed, or drawing a blank on my right wording here, but about what did we save in cost of the general fund? Do you remember that offhand? We did that analysis before we went out last time.
We did. And every time that we do it, there's the calculation. We could look back in time, but I don't have an exact number, but I know that it's tens of millions,
That's what I
like
was
over
thinking.
40+ million long-term. Now, that's a projection given what we think the market will do over time, and only time tells, really, but we are talking tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, this board did a really good job. The Salem Keizer board did a really good job at the right time.
Yeah, I agree.
That's it. I think that's all the questions that we had. Thank you very much.
All right, next meeting is budget message on Tuesday, April 24th at 6 p.m. And the other meeting I'm noting here is we do have a budget committee meeting on May 8th, and we're going to add public comment to that meeting, because one of the things that was happening in the budget process is you got the bulk of the public comment at the end of the process, and so we thought moving it up earlier in the process would be important, especially right after the budget message. So that is the first opportunity for public comment. We'll still take public comment before you approve the budget, but we'll take it that night, so it gives you a sense of what people want to tell you about the proposed budget.
What is the actual day of the May election?
The May election's on May 15th.
Is that it?
That's it for me.
Did we just close?
Nope, you can adjourn.
Yeah. So just adjourn the, sorry. Okay, well, with that, we will adjourn the Salem Keizer Budget Committee. Thank you.